Now today, Ducati announced a major update for their Multistrada V4 adventure bike, along with the super sporty Pikes Peak version. So in this video, we'll go through all of the details with the key things that you need to know about. Now probably the reason that this bike has been updated now, as well as being a few years since the last update, is the fact that we've got new emissions regulations coming in with Euro 5B or 5+. So while the engine, the brilliant V4 Gran Turismo, is fundamentally the same, with the same 170 horsepower peak, the same peak torque figure, they've just cleaned it up a bit to keep it within the constraints of the new requirements. Presumably, part of that has been the exhaust system, and while they were working on it, they also say they took the opportunity to enhance the sound. And I will say, having ridden multiple versions of the previous iteration, it was one of the parts of the bike that I just found a little bit disappointing. It felt like it could have been more bassy and rich, even from a stock exhaust system that passes these requirements. They say they've given it a more personal tone, so hopefully that means a bit more personality, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what this new one sounds like, because of course, being a V4, it's got bags of potential. Now the other thing to point out with the engine is the fact that it now gets their extended rear cylinder deactivation, which pretty much trickles down from the rally variant of the Multistrada V4, and I also think the Diavel V4 Power Cruiser. You see, the previous generation did have standard rear cylinder deactivation, and the general idea of this is to keep you cool when you're sat at the lights in traffic by shutting off those rear two cylinders, which are right under your nuts. While you're sitting there, the front two cylinders are keeping the engine ticking over, and then the whole thing kicks back in as soon as you touch the throttle. Now the extended version, which was previously, like I say, only on the rally, maintains this behavior at low speeds as well, so it should also keep you cool when you're riding in slow moving traffic, for example. It's a little bit weird to think about the fact that effectively you're just riding a 500cc parallel twin at low speeds, but as well as the cooling benefits, you've also got to consider that they say overall this version of the engine is now 6% more fuel efficient, and that should be welcome news indeed, because this has always been one of the more thirsty adventure bikes on the market. Generally though, I'm not expecting this bike to be massively different to ride because of the same output figures from the engine, and also the fact that the chassis is largely the same too. The only change in the press release that I think is worth mentioning is the fact that they've moved the swing arm pivot up by 1 millimeter, and this is said to improve the anti-squat behavior of the bike. In their words, they say the intention is to make riding more precise and effective, even at full load. And in fact, full load riding, so with a passenger and luggage, is a little bit of a common theme amongst some of these updates. Take the luggage, for example, they've moved it back by 25 millimeters, and that's said to give the passenger a little bit more space, especially for their legs. And also, the rear rack is a little more robust, which means that the top box becomes a more reassuring backrest for the passenger. Then you've also got the suspension, so the preload on the rear shock now has a greater range. And so combined with the auto leveling feature that basically automatically adjusts the preload no matter how much you've got loaded up on the bike, it should be able to quickly and conveniently find the optimal setting regardless of how much you've chucked on the back there. And I guess the other thing to consider as well is the fact that they've moved the luggage back by 25 millimeters, and that might allow the passenger to move back a little bit as well. And so presumably all of that weight has a bit more leverage over the rear shock, so more of a range of preload must be a good thing. There are plenty of things, in fact, to get stuck into here with the suspension. So the other thing they've included now is an auto ride height feature, which kicks in at speeds of under 10 kilometers per hour and then automatically jacks back up at over 50 kilometers per hour. The idea is it makes it easier to get both your feet down when you come to a standstill, which is always a good thing if you've got the bike really loaded up. And I assume this is a response to the BMW R1300 GS, which was released with a similar feature earlier this year, and when I tested it out, I did think it was really rather good. Now, it is worth pointing out that the previous generation Multistrada V4 did have a very similar feature called minimum preload, but with this one you had to manually press a button on the switchgear to get it to drop down. And having tested bikes with both the two systems, so a manual button or automatic, I much prefer that GS version because you just don't have to think about it and it feels totally natural. Then we've got to mention this new fork sensor which ties into their Skyhook semi-active electronic suspension system. The general idea of Skyhook is that it keeps the main body of the bike traveling level, almost as if it's suspended from a hook in the sky, hence the name. And the suspension does all the work with the wheels to soak up any undulations in the road or surface. And I think it's best demonstrated with this excellent video, which I have used in the past, but it's worth showing again here, of a Multistrada V4 riding down some stairs, and I think it looks really impressive as to how composed the main part of the bike is. As part of this new system though, it does say with this fork sensor it can bring in some predictive behavior, like a feature that they're calling bump detection. From what I've read, I think how this system works is that if the fork sensor hits like a sudden bump, like a pothole or something like that, then in real time it'll immediately completely back off the damping on the rear shock in order to give you the maximum chance of like soaking up that hit. And look, I think that's going to be especially comforting to passengers because we've all been over potholes or speed bumps where it basically launches the passenger out of the seat. And so yeah, another one that I'm definitely interested to test out when we can get a press bike next year, although it's going to be a bit of a weird review, taking a 20-odd thousand pound adventure bike to seek out potholes to absolutely middle at a good speed. Lastly, on the suspension specifically, you can now change the settings on the fly regardless of which riding mode you're in. And so that's going to be particularly handy if you ride in between motorways and then straight onto back roads, for example, where you might want to preserve that sporty throttle response but be able to dial in the comfort and composure of the ride. That might be the longest section I've ever done in a news video on the suspension, so let's move swiftly on to the brakes, which are linked. So if you use the front brake lever, for example, it'll electronically, on your behalf, apply both the front and rear brake calipers in order to stop the bike as quickly and safely as possible. It's becoming an increasingly common feature on bikes of all different genres, but specifically on a big bike like this, when you're two up with luggage, it's something that I'd probably rather have than not. New for this update though, this 2025 bike, well, as well as the front lever being linked, you've also got it on the rear brake pedal too, so the rear brake pedal will effectively operate both brakes. This one I'm a little bit less sure about because it is nice to have the option to drag the rear brake, for example, when you're riding at lower speeds. It can give you a bit of extra control, but again, we'll reserve judgment until I actually get to ride the bike. Now onto the tech package, and the Multistrada V4 was in fact one of the first bikes to get radar technology with active cruise control powered by the radar at the front and also blind spot warnings powered by one at the rear. This year though, front collision warnings have also been added, and so I assume that's going to flash a warning up on the dash when it thinks you're approaching the traffic in front at a potentially dangerous rate. Sounds fairly sensible to me to make use of the hardware that's on the bike in this way, and the only thing I will say is it's a bit of a shame they haven't added rear collision warnings as well. Now they've put this on the 2025 GS's, and essentially what it does is flashes the rear indicators to warn traffic behind you if they think they're approaching at a potentially dangerous rate. Still, could be one for like a mid-cycle update. Now on top of that, in the tech department, they've also got this new system called DVO, which stands for Ducati Vehicle Observer, and it was first announced, I think, for their sort of production bikes on the recent Panigale V4 announcement, but previous to that, it trickles down from tech that was developed for their MotoGP program. Basically, I think this is a software thing which they say simulates the inputs of 70 sensors integrated with the data from the inertial measurement units, so the sort of lean angles and stuff like that, and it gives them a view of the bike and the way that the bike's behaving in much greater detail. As for what sort of benefit this translates to for the rider, well, the result they say is refined strategies for the cornering ABS, the Ducati wheelie control, and also the Ducati traction control system, so hopefully a safer bike to ride at speed. Riding modes have also been mixed up a little bit, so there's now a wet mode for the first time. This one limits peak power to 115 horses and of course ramps up the traction control keenness and also the ABS, although it does sound quite similar to the urban riding mode which was on the previous generation and also still exists on this new one too. Now all of this stuff of course is managed through the 6.5-inch color TFT display, which I think on this generation is the same hardware as the previous gen. But they do say they've redesigned the menus and some of the layouts, specifically with the new suspension settings in mind to make them easier to access and navigate. So yeah, lots of tweaks all across the bike. I guess the sum of all of those things could be quite significant in terms of how the bike feels to ride. But then also it's wrapped in this new styling package, which does give it a bit of a fresh new look. Now the front end is said to be sort of in line with that Panigale V4 update, which in turn took its cues from iconic sports bikes of the past like the 916 and the 1098. Although they do say that the headlight redesign also improves its function a little bit, so there's less of a dead patch around the front wheel, and also the cornering headlights are meant to be better too. It is a significant change to the front end, and they've also neatened at the back a bit with that new exhaust system. And so I'd love to know what you think of the looks, with it being so subjective, down in the comments below. Now, as I said at the top of this video, the Pikes Peak Edition has also been updated, and this is basically a sporty interpretation of the Multi V4 with a more agile 17-inch front wheel and completely road biased Pirelli Diablo Rosso 4 tyres. The trade-off, of course, is removing any off-road ability or intentions, but if you are going to just ride this bike entirely on the road, then this thing is going to be almost unbeatable in terms of like being seriously quick, but also seriously comfortable. And the only other bike that I would suggest as a competitor for this will be the M1000 XR from BMW. As per the last Pikes Peak bike, well, you've still got the Panigale V4 derived brakes, you've got the upgraded suspension as well with Öhlins Smart EC2 semi-active suspension, but with this new 2025 version, all of the updates pretty much from that base Multistrada V4 are carried over. So the styling redesign, the extended rear cylinder deactivation, the millimeter higher swing arm pivot, the Ducati vehicle observer electronics, moving the luggage back by 25 mils they say, the better cornering lights, and so on. Pretty much everything that I've spotted in the press release also exists in the Pikes Peak press release as well. As for prices, well, unfortunately we don't have them yet. I'm sure they'll be up as soon as I publish this video, so I'll stick them in the comments below as a pinned comment. But look, whatever it is, it's not going to be cheap. This was already one of the more expensive adventure bikes on the market, even if you compare it spec by spec to some of the competition. And with these being new 2025 models, I'd expect them to be at least $1 or $2 grand up on the previous generation. I'd love to know though what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below, and also which one would you go for, this or the GS? That has to be the main competitor for this bike, so if you haven't seen it already, I'll put my full review on the screen now so you can give it a click and give it a watch. And also, please do hit subscribe if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.